Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Jason Jewell about his Great Books project. Dr. Jewell is the chairman of the Department of Humanities and an associate professor at Faulkner University. He is a faculty member at libertyclassroom.com and edits the Journal of Faith in the Academy with Josh Fullman. You can follow his work on his blog, The Western Tradition, at westerntradition.wordpress.com, and you can go to studyliberalarts.org to learn more about his university programs. You can find him on Facebook under Jason Jewell and on Twitter at West Tradition. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/great-books. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me on, Adam.
Well, sure. Thanks for joining me. So let's just start out by discussing what this project even is. So what is the Great Books Project, and what is your progress on the project?
The Great Books Project is something that I started back in 2011. My original idea was to read through the entire Great Books of the Western World series, which is a 60-volume series that's edited by Mortimer Adler, formerly of the University of Chicago. My plan was to read through that body of material, which is about 40,000 pages worth of material, in 7 years. And the plan was to make weekly posts on my blog about the things that I was reading each week. I decided that I would be in multiple works at the same time. So if you go to the blog and you look at any of these Great Books posts, you'll see short observations on about half a dozen different works that I'm reading at any one time. And I knew that a 7-year goal for trying to get through this body of readings was very ambitious, but I managed to stay on track with it for about 4 years, and then I got held up by some developments in what we might call real life, I suppose. I'm up to 6 children now. I had 4 when I started the project, but I have 6 now, and my responsibilities at the university have increased since I started the project too, along with some other things that I had not originally foreseen when I started the project, such as my involvement with Liberty Classroom. So I don't know whether I'm going to hit the 7-year timetable as I had originally planned, but I am still reading and posting on the blog about what I'm doing in any particular week. And hopefully I will ultimately make it all the way through that body of work. It's a really big job, but the value of reading through these great works has been great for me. I've learned an incredible amount, and we can talk about any particular authors that you're interested in, or the way the project is set up, how it's structured, whichever way you want to take the conversation, Adam.
Yeah, sure. I must say that's pretty impressive, completing 4 years right on schedule. That's pretty good. So congratulations on that, and I think that's over halfway. So congratulations on that. But yeah, you mentioned in there the value that you've gotten out of this project, and all the knowledge and lessons that you've learned from this. So can you flesh that out in a little more detail? What value have you gotten out of this project, and what value would someone get out of a comparable project if they were to undertake one?
Sure. Well, Mortimer Adler, the guy who edited this collection of writing, as I said, he was at the University of Chicago for much of the second half of the 20th century, and he was a philosophy professor. One of the things that he did to accompany this collection was to put together a huge index that takes up about 2 volumes of the 60-volume set. And what he did was to go through all the works by, authors from Homer coming all the way up to 20th century authors like Sigmund Freud, and cataloged references, indexed references in all of these works, and keyed them to what he called the great ideas. So in this 2-volume index that as part of the Great Books of the Western World series, he has this list of 100 of what he calls the great ideas. And these range, from all over the place, everything from nature and God to a lot of ideas that people who are interested in political economy would find very stimulating. I know your podcast deals with politics and international relations and things like that, but some of the great ideas that he identified as being great ideas that have a big influence throughout human history are things like liberty, government, democracy, all sorts of things like that. And if you just look through that list of 100 great ideas, I'm sure that anybody, no matter who you are, would find quite a few of them that you are personally very interested in and would like to know more about. Well, by reading through all of this 40,000 pages of material, I'm soaking up along the way a lot of information and a lot of insights about each of these ideas. So I'm becoming, a much more knowledgeable person simply from having exposure to these ideas, many of whom are from people that I don't necessarily agree with, but it's important, I think, for my own intellectual development and for anyone else who wants to, really become well educated in this area, is, to encounter ideas that you don't like and to figure out how to wrestle with them and to consider carefully the arguments that people are making and figure out how to answer them. So I'm getting a lot of experience doing that through this reading. I am also becoming a lot more familiar with certain genres of writing that I had never really spent a lot of time looking at in my own career. Of course, I'm a university professor. There are certain areas as a humanities professor that I have a lot of experience with. When I was going through graduate school, I focused primarily on history. So my master's degree is in history. My PhD is an interdisciplinary degree, but the majority of my courses that I took at the doctoral level were also in history. So I had read, many, many great historians through the years, but I had not read many of the great philosophers, for example. I had not read many of the great novelists, and I certainly hadn't read many of the great writers of scientific literature and mathematical theorists and things like that. But all those genres of writing are represented in this Great Books of the Western World series. So as I was starting to make my way through, I immediately started encountering very unfamiliar stuff. I was reading Euclid's writings on geometry from the ancient world, and I was reading poets and authors of short stories and novels that I had never encountered before, 19th and 20th century novelists, for example, that I wasn't familiar with, along with a lot of philosophical works too. So becoming conversant with those genres of writing, again, it's made me, I think, a much more well-rounded person and able to have intelligent conversations with other people on a variety of different areas that, of course, the more familiar you get with the more disciplines, the better you are able to speak to a lot of issues that are current in society today. So I found that to be very valuable for my own personal development and also for my teaching too. In my role as a professor, I'm always coming across students and, of course, colleagues who are dealing primarily with other fields than mine, and it's very useful to be able to build relationships with these students and colleagues to be able to have intelligent conversations on the things that are most interesting to them. So that's been really valuable as well.
It sounds like it. Can you talk about the structure of the project a little more and how this is set up and all of the different types of literature and works that are involved in a project like this?
Okay, so when I first started this, I was trying to figure out a way to keep the readings organized. And I wanted, as I was going through, as I just said, we've got these different genres of writing represented in the project. And I wanted to make sure that I was not sort of playing to my own biases as I was working through the readings. I didn't want to just dive into the works that were familiar and comfortable for me and shying away from the works that were more unfamiliar and that I would find more difficult. So what I did on the front end was set up a little spreadsheet for myself and added up, as best I could tell, about the number of pages that are present in this series of books from each of these different categories, whether it's imaginative literature, man and society is one of the categories that Adler represents. This would include history, but also social science, the economics writings, and so on. Then there's the natural and scientific writings, the mathematical writings, and then finally philosophy and theology was the last category. So I took the volumes off the shelf. I looked at the page count of each one of them. I tried to figure out about how many pages total were representative of each of these genres in the series. And then I just did a little bit of arithmetic to figure out if I'm going to be reading these works for 7 years, first of all, how much would I have to read every week to try to stay on track to finish in 7 years? And then once I know that, about how many pages of each genre of writing should I read per week to try to stay current with each of the genres as I go forward. So once I figured that out, it might sound a little complicated, but it actually didn't take that long to do, maybe an hour or two. Then I started looking at the table of contents for each of these volumes and trying to figure out, well, if I'm going to read something of mathematics, what would I be interested in reading first? And I just started, it was kind of like ordering off a menu, sort of looking at the table of contents from each of these books and saying, well, I think I'll try that this week or this one over here. And so that was a pretty fun, has been a pretty fun angle to use. But I try to take my readings each week so that they roughly fit that page count that I need to shoot for to make sure that I get through in the time that I had budgeted for myself. So what that has boiled down to means that about half of the readings that I do each week comes from imaginative literature and social science type writing, and about the other half of it comes from scientific writing and philosophical writing. So I'm trying to keep myself balanced as I go through, but I keep track of all the readings that I have done on this spreadsheet. I update it every week as I make a new post on the blog, and it's been really vital because, like I said, 40,000 pages worth of reading to do to try to keep track of what I've done and what I haven't done, what I still need to plan for. That's been a logistical challenge to some degree, and I always have people commenting on the blog. So where's your reading plan? Where can I get a list of all the readings? And I do have an index on the blog of the posts that I make from week to week, but I have to tell these people, I don't have the complete reading plan. I'm still making this up as I go along. And there's no, Mortimer Adler didn't provide some kind of script, read these books in these orders or anything like that. I'm kind of doing this on my own. So it's been exciting to try to keep that working as I go through. And I'm hoping that once I get to the end of this, that I'll be able to create some kind of manageable reading plan for people who do want to try to tackle the same kind of project that I've done. But that's basically the approach I've taken, is try to keep the readings from the different genres balanced from week to week. And it's been a little bit of a challenge, but it also keeps me, as I said before, keeps me honest in terms of not just trying to run to the works that I find most comfortable and most familiar.
Sure. Well, it sounds great. And before we get into specific works and authors, I want to ask you about the different civilizations and cultures that are covered. Now, obviously, this is focused within Western civilization, but within Western civilization, this could be taken in many different directions, of course. So what are all of the different cultures and civilizations that are covered in this project?
Okay, good question. Adler started the series with a volume containing the epics of Homer. So the first volume there is the Iliad and the Odyssey. So he starts in ancient Greece. And probably about the first 10 volumes or so, I'm guessing, actually probably going up to maybe close to 15 volumes, are Greek and Roman writers. So he does not have in the series any of what we would call the ancient Near Eastern civilizations. He doesn't have Mesopotamian authors. He doesn't have the Epic of Gilgamesh in there. He doesn't have anything from the Bible in there, although he did offer an explanation for that. He said when he first created this series of books back in the 50s, he said, look, I know everybody has easy access to the Bible. Most homes in America have a Bible in them, so it'd be kind of redundant for me to to put a volume of the Bible in the great books of the Western world. But he did say very clearly that he thinks that knowledge of the Bible is essential for cultural literacy for any educated, Western person. So with that caveat aside, he starts with Greek and Roman authors, and then there's a handful of works from the European Middle Ages. He has volumes in there from St. Augustine, from St. Thomas Aquinas, Dante, Geoffrey Chaucer, but comparatively little from the Middle Ages. Adler was typical, I think, of a lot of 20th century intellectuals in thinking that the Western tradition is really primarily about the Greek and Roman heritage, and then sort of jumping over the Middle Ages, and then that Greek and Roman heritage gets revived in the Italian Renaissance. So there's maybe a little bit of a bias there. If I had put the list together, I would have put more medieval works into it. But you get to about, again, as I said, this is a 60-volume series. By the time you get to about volume 21, 22 or so, you are in what we might consider the modern era with writers from the 16th century and going forward. So again, it's mostly European writers, although when you get up to the 18th century, you start seeing American writers represented there as well. Some of the critics of the Great Books of the Western World series say that Adler put too much emphasis on writers from the English-speaking world. Of course, his defense there was that he was creating the compilation, the collection for English-speaking readers primarily, so he thought it was natural to maybe overrepresent English speakers in the collection because they've had a larger influence on the English-speaking world that the series is designed to speak to. So you have a lot of writers such as, John Stuart Mill. I'm thinking of English-speaking writers in particular. You've got the Federalist Papers in there from the American side. You have Mark Twain represented as one of the American authors. British authors, you have figures like Jane Austen, novelists, of course, but also a number of writers other European writers who wrote in other languages. So there are Russian novelists there. There are French political theorists. Montesquieu, for example, is represented in the Great Book series. A lot of German writers as well. I've already mentioned Sigmund Freud, but there are others such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the author of Faust. So a lot of different, if we're looking at the Western world, it's a pretty eclectic group of writers. And again, for listeners to your podcast, I know are particularly interested in politics and economics, they might be disappointed to know that Adler apparently was not very familiar with the tradition of Austrian economics, although in some of the supplemental material, not the primary texts in his collection, but he did have in some of his for further reading sections. He does have, for example, writings of Frederick Bastiat, the writings of Ludwig von Mises, and so on. But the main text within the series itself, in terms of political economy, he does have Adam Smith in there. He has Alexis de Tocqueville. He has Karl Marx, of course, and then John Maynard Keynes, the general theory is in there. So a lot of very robust selection of texts, some of which are quite difficult to navigate for people who are not specialists in those disciplines. But Adler really believed that a person with a good general education could at least make a real effort, take a real stab at trying to wrestle with these works and understand them at least to some degree. Adler always said that if you want to grow as a reader, you need to be looking at and reading texts that are over your head, so to speak. And as you wrestle with those texts that are over your head, you get better as a reader, and you get more knowledgeable as a result. So I've maybe wandered a little bit from the original question, but the selection of authors there, I think, is very broad and a good representation of what we would consider to be the major writers in the Western tradition, at least up through the mid-20th century, which is when Adler stopped making his selections. He said that you always need to have about 50 years or so to give some time before you can judge whether a work has really stood the test of time and ought to still be on reading lists and that sort of thing. So the last edition of the Great Books of the Western World, which was put out in 1990, had works up through about the 1940s. George Orwell's Animal Farm, for example, is in the list, but that's where he stops chronologically.
Okay, well, it's just impressive how much time it covers and how many different authors and types of works are covered. It sounds very impressive, and I'm impressed at how broad the list is. So who are some well-known figures, and what are some well-known works that you were familiar with to some degree before this project, but you have come to appreciate much more so and you've learned much more about since then? What would stand out in that category, and what would stand out as some lesser-known figures and works that you weren't quite as familiar with, that you have gained a much better appreciation, understanding of over the course of this project?
Okay, yeah, great question again. I would say that when I started this project, there were some authors that I really needed to be familiar with. In fact, I was teaching some of these authors to college students and even to graduate students that I had never really been fully immersed in. And some of those would be, for example, some of the great philosophers, Plato and Aristotle. You know, I had never been required to read Plato and Aristotle in my own academic work, except for maybe one or two pieces by them. And I come in as a professor, and I am having to teach some of these authors to students without ever having really been immersed in them. And so that's been really valuable. Those authors in particular, not just having familiarity with a handful of the most famous works, but actually working my way through their entire collection of what has survived of those writers. That has been really valuable. I mean, I had read some things like Plato's Apology is a short work that's very well known that a lot of students in high school and college read. Of course, I was familiar with works like that, but some of the works that to most academics today would be a little more obscure, I had never read. And so I've gotten a lot more familiar with the writings of those philosophers. In terms of some of the other categories, the scientific literature, for example, I think I already mentioned Euclid there. I have read, as part of this project, a lot of Francis Bacon, Rene Descartes. They had, of course, pioneers in the 17th century in creating what is understood now to be kind of the modern scientific outlook. And so I've become a lot more familiar with their writings, and I think understand the modern world a lot better, sort of the assumptions that undergird the way modern people think a lot better than I used to as a result of doing these readings. I'm ashamed to say, even though my mother is or was a literature professor for many years and always loved the works of John Milton, I had never read Paradise Lost before reading it as part of this project. So that was a big thing for me. Some of the other works of imaginative literature, some of the great 19th and 20th century novelists I had never read before, because in my own academic career, I had always been focused on the medieval and early modern period. So you get up past the 17th century, and the exposure I had had to a lot of that work really dropped off. But as part of this project, I've wound up reading great novelists like Jane Austen, for example, Leo Tolstoy. In fact, part of what I'm doing right now, some of my current posts, I'm working my way through War and Peace, which I actually did read through on a very superficial level about 20 years ago, but really did not get it. And now I am back into it a lot deeper and understanding Tolstoy a lot better, I think, as a result of a lot of the reading that I've done as part of this project. So those are some of the big names. Some of the names that people might not be as familiar with, but are sort of like, to 21st century readers at least, maybe undiscovered gems. I read Henry Fielding's Tom Jones. That's a very entertaining novel. It's written in the 18th century, around the 1740s, and considered to be one of the most important works that sort of helped to define what the modern novel is. You know, sort of the way the novel is supposed to work and how characters are supposed to develop and that sort of thing. So Tom Jones and it's a comic novel too. It's very funny. And I really enjoyed reading that. It's one that not very many people have read today, or maybe have even heard of. See, maybe one or two of the others I had never read before coming to do this project. The essays of Montaigne, the 16th century figure who wrote about all kinds of things. If you look at the essays of Montaigne, he was a French nobleman who sort of lived a quiet life in the countryside at his country house, and just wrote these meditations on all kinds of different subjects, everything from, how to raise horses to the meaning of life and growing old and all these sorts of things. And he's been a favorite of intellectuals and educated people for many hundreds of years, but I was completely unfamiliar with his writings. So being able to read his essays has been very valuable for me, I think. I could go on, but those are some of the names that come to mind immediately when you ask maybe who are some of the less well-known people that I've really enjoyed reading.
Okay, yeah. So the next part of this interview is going to be a little difficult to pull off probably, but I want to go rapid fire through some authors, through some figures and a handful of works, and look at sort of who the person is that wrote the work, and if I ask about a specific work, kind of a brief overview of what that work entails. So I don't want to spend too long on any one person or work, and I want to try to get through a few of these here. But let's start out with some that you're reading right now, and you mentioned one of these in particular in your last answer there, and that's War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. So can you give sort of a brief overview of Tolstoy and War and Peace and what's entailed there?
Okay. Tolstoy is a Russian novelist. He writes in the late 19th century, and his two greatest works that are considered part of the Western canon are War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Well, War and Peace is a novel about the Napoleonic Wars. So it's set in the first couple of decades of the 19th century, and it's a sprawling novel. There are many dozens of characters. It's difficult to keep up with them all. But Tolstoy has these characters move in and out of the major political events of the Napoleonic era. And several of the characters are soldiers in the Russian army. And so they have a front row seat to some of the major battles, such as the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. So Tolstoy presents these very vivid portraits of those battles and what it might be like for a character who's stuck in the middle of them. But at the same time, he's presenting a kind of broader philosophy of history, so to speak. And Tolstoy was very big on the idea of most things are outside of human control. There are these huge forces at work, and individual human beings don't really have a chance to influence historical events in the way they might like to, or in the way they fool themselves into thinking that they are influencing them. He's more of what we would call a philosophical determinist. So maybe is that about the length of answer you're looking for here?
Yeah, sure. That's good. Yeah, so we should be able to move through a few of these. So the next one I want to get to, and again, it looks like you're reading this one right now, and that's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon.
Yeah, another very sprawling work. In fact, it takes up 2 full volumes in Adler's series. And I'm guessing it's probably a total of about, in his edition, between maybe 1,200 pages or something like that, maybe even more than that. But Gibbon is and was very controversial when he first published this the series of volumes about the Roman Empire in the 18th century, because he was sort of attacking the traditional notions of how the understanding of how Rome fell. He blamed the fall of the Roman Empire, at least in part, on Christianity, that Christianity had brought in a new way of looking at the world that didn't really lend itself to upholding a great civilization. And so he thought that Christianity was something that had harmed the Roman Empire, which was contrary to the way, of course, that most people understood things in the 18th century. He is very good. I mean, he's a great literary stylist, and he writes with a lot of verve or zest, I guess. There's a lot of really interesting little vignettes about characters and emperors and generals and things like that in his novels. I say novels, in his history. But at the same time, he's pretty subtle in smuggling in a lot of the biases that he has that are, I guess, we might call them somewhat materialist in tone and opposed to Christianity.
All right, and one more that it looks like you're reading right now, and that's the Summa Theologica of St. Thomas Aquinas.
Yes, the Summa is one that I have done portions of and then stepped back from for a while and then come back to it because, again, it's such a mammoth work. This is another one that takes up 2 volumes in Adler's series. Adler doesn't even have the entire Summa in the Great Books of the Western World. He takes out chunks of it because it's just too large. But it's one of the most challenging works, I think, for modern people to deal with because his way of presenting information is in a very unfamiliar style. He will present some idea or some question that he wants to answer. For example, right up at the beginning, he asks the question, is there a God? And then he comes up with several different arguments for why he thinks we should accept the idea of God. But the way the information is presented is in a very structured and rigorous way that doesn't really lend itself well to rhetorical flourishes or anything like that. And to a lot of modern readers, it seems really dry, very tedious to try to get through. But the ideas are very powerful. And one of the great things about St. Thomas is that he always wants to give the people that he is arguing against the very best argument that he can give them. He never engages in attacking straw men or anything like that. And of course, anyone who pays attention to political discussion today knows it's all ad hominem and straw men and all that sort of thing. And St. Thomas never does that. He never tries to score cheap points against his opponents. He always wants to give them the strongest argument that he can, even if he disagrees with them, because he's interested in trying to find out the truth of things. I think it's a great model for how people should behave when they are engaging with people that they disagree with. Go into the argument in good faith, be more concerned with trying to find out the truth rather than scoring cheap points. And so I think modern people, even though the style is not what they're accustomed to, would do very well to take a look at some of the way that St. Thomas presents his arguments.
All right, and now for some figures, many of whom you've mentioned in passing over the course of this interview, but it looks like you're not currently reading their works, but I want to get to a few of these. So St. Augustine's the first one there.
Yeah, okay, so Augustine is a figure who lives in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the last days of the Roman Empire. And in the Great Books of the Western World series, there are 3 of his works. There's his Confessions, which is considered to be, by a lot of literary scholars, to be the first real autobiography in world history. So it's very significant, even apart from from his status as a religious figure. Then there is his City of God, which is another kind of sprawling work elaborating a philosophy of history. And there, Augustine is arguing that basically his contemporaries are saying that the Christian church is doomed because the Roman Empire is failing. And Augustine is saying, actually, the success of the church does not depend on whether the Roman Empire, the political state, whether it flourishes or not. In fact, the kingdom or the city of God, as he describes the church, and the city of man, which is what he calls the earthly political kingdoms, those are very separate things. Christians should not owe loyalty to the city of man. They should focus on their citizenship in the city of God. So it's at the same time a sort of reassurance to his contemporary fellow believers that the church has a bright future ahead of it, but also it's been really, I guess, maybe the primary way of understanding the relationship between maybe church and state that Christians have had for the last 1,500 years. And then his final work in the Great Books of the Western World series is called On Christian Doctrine, in which he's elaborating what he thinks of the importance and the significance of a lot of the key Christian doctrines, such as the incarnation of Christ, for example.
All right, and another figure that you mentioned earlier, Homer, and a lot of high school and college students, of course, will read the Odyssey and the Iliad, but I'm assuming it's much different reading his works as part of this project than it is reading it in high school or college and whatnot.
Yeah, I suspect that high school students or college students who are, most of them who are assigned to read one of those epics, they're probably taken by the hand, so to speak, by their teacher and kind of walked through at a slow pace a lot of what's happening there. And some of that is necessary, I think, for younger readers who may not be familiar so much with the sort of world that Homer is writing in. I would recommend to people who are interested in Homer, but maybe are a little scared of trying to jump right in because of the unfamiliar way in which the story is presented, maybe to pick up, do a refresher on Greek mythology, pick up a copy of Bulfinch's Mythology or something like that, and refamiliarize yourself with some of these ancient myths, well, some of which you may not be familiar with at all. And then when you go to read the Iliad or the Odyssey or Virgil's Aeneid, the other great ancient epic poem that all Western people should be familiar with, you'll understand a lot of the references and allusions that are made in those texts. But Homer, by common consensus, is the sort of fountainhead of the entire Western literary tradition. So I think it is the case that anyone who wants to be considered a well-educated, well-rounded person in the Western world needs to be pretty familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then, as I also said, Virgil's Aeneid.
Right, and I was going to ask about this anyways, but since you mentioned it there, this is a perfect opportunity. The Aeneid by Virgil, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, in some ways, it's even more influential than the Iliad and the Odyssey in the history of the West, because Virgil wrote in Latin as a Roman author, and for many centuries in Western Europe, the direct knowledge of the texts of the Iliad and the Odyssey was lost, because in the Middle Ages, very few, if any, people in Western Europe spoke or read Greek. So Virgil was the primary ancient text that they used to form the basis of their own stories about the Greek and Roman gods and that sort of thing. So, for example, when you read Dante's great epic poem, The Divine Comedy, the Inferno and the Purgatory and the Paradise, he has Virgil show up at the beginning of the Inferno, and Virgil acts as Dante's guide, and it's full of references and allusions to the Aeneid. And I'd say going probably up into the 18th century, every educated person in the West was very familiar with the Aeneid, but they might not have been that familiar with directly with the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's not until translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey from the Greek come into the Western languages in the early modern period that the educated people really start immersing themselves in Homer again. So in fact, we made a change recently in our freshman level honors course here at the university, where instead of having them read Homer their first semester, we have them read the Aeneid now, because it is so fundamental, and it's going to come back over and over in their later semesters as they read these other authors, such as Augustine or such as Dante, who are referring back to Virgil all the time. I mean, you'd be shocked about how often these guys are referring back to Virgil. So I would say, yeah, definitely that's one you want to put high on your reading list. It's the only ancient source that we have surviving that tells us the story of the Trojan horse, the way that the Trojan War ended. So that by itself, I think, makes it very significant.
Definitely. Just a few more I want to get to very quickly, and I'm going to lump two figures together here just for the sake of time here, but Plato and Aristotle.
Okay, I said a few things about Plato and Aristotle earlier, but again, these guys are sort of the fountainhead in some ways of the Western philosophical tradition. Of course, you have to throw Socrates in there, but Socrates didn't actually write anything. Most of what we know about Socrates comes through Plato, and Socrates is a character in most of the fictional dialogues that Plato composed. But these guys together are very significant in teaching us how to frame questions. A lot of people in the modern world, and I know a lot of libertarians, for example, particularly if they've been influenced by Ayn Rand, might have some beef with Plato. And in fact, I know that over at the Foundation for Economic Education, Richard Ebeling recently had some piece about how Plato is the father of all totalitarianism and that sort of thing, which I think is overstating the case quite a bit. But even if you don't like a lot of Plato's conclusions, his way of figuring out how to ask questions, philosophical questions, I think is extremely important for modern people to become familiar with. And Aristotle, Plato's greatest student, of course, disagreed with Plato on certain important questions. And I think that when it comes to questions of political organization and things like that, I think most of us would probably gravitate a little more towards Aristotle's ideas than we would to Plato's, even though Aristotle himself is not really a libertarian or anything like that, but he does have a strong emphasis on private property, for example, and why that's so valuable in maintaining an orderly society. But Aristotle, in particular, is so impressive because of the wide range of subjects on which he wrote, not only political questions and metaphysical questions, but also he was the greatest scientific author of his day. He wrote all kinds of treatises on biology and astronomy and physics and other kinds of things that today we would consider part of the physical sciences. He also, still to this day, may be the preeminent author in the area of logic. And I would strongly recommend to anybody, any educated person, read some of Aristotle's works on logic. They're extremely valuable. He uncovered sort of timeless rules of logical reasoning that our society, to some extent, if you watch TV, you can tell that we've lost that to some degree in our popular culture, and it would be very good for us to recover that. But again, both of those authors, very fundamental in the Western tradition. Highly recommended reading.
All right, and two figures that you lumped together in passing earlier, and then you briefly brought up again, but Dante and Chaucer.
Okay. Dante and Chaucer, probably the two figures in the area of imaginative literature. We might call them the crowning achievement of the Middle Ages. Dante is writing around the year 1300, Chaucer about 75 to 100 years after that. And I'm sure most of your listeners remember reading either Dante or Chaucer or both in high school. But Dante, certainly the greatest epic poet of the Middle Ages, and I would put the Divine Comedy up there with the three ancient epics that I've already mentioned, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, as sort of required reading for anyone who wants to claim a good familiarity with the Western tradition. It is a work that is really, really profound and has a lot of modern applications, even though Dante is very clearly writing to people in a specific time and place, and he is singling out individual people who were part of his society, in 1300 and criticizing them or praising them. But at the same time, he's also presenting a bigger picture of what life is like when either your loves and your desires are out of whack, which is what the Inferno is really about, or what your life is like as you are trying to improve yourself and get into the right place, which is what the purgatory is about to a great extent, or what life is like in a harmonious community, which is what the paradise is about. And so, again, I know many of your listeners are very interested in politics and economics. I think it's significant that over at the American Conservative website, the American Conservative magazine, just within the last few days, I read an article in which an author was applying insights from the Divine Comedy to our political situation in 2016 and saying, look, people who consider themselves conservative, they have a lot of thinking to do, with the whole Donald Trump phenomenon and all that sort of thing. And we're at a moment where we really need some reflection, and Dante can help us to do this. And he has passages that speak directly to what we're going through. I mean, it's very rare that you could think of an author who was writing 600 or 700 years ago who is speaking, as it seems, directly to your situation today in the year 2016. I mean, that's why Dante, among other reasons, is why he's considered to be one of the greatest authors, that he deals with timeless ideas. Chaucer, more significant for the history of English literature specifically, but again, a great author who gives us a lot of very profound ideas in the collection of stories, the Canterbury Tales, that most of us have some degree of familiarity with. But he gives us a brilliant portrait of his own society with the prologue to the Canterbury Tales and all the different characters, and we find out sort of what makes people tick in the year 1400. But then as they tell their stories, we're also drawn back into, these are ideas that are still very relevant to us today. Ideas of friendship and ideas of love and how to relate to the divine, all these kinds of things that people are still wrestling with today. Chaucer gives us great insight into those things as well.
All right, and two more I want to get to very quickly before we wrap up here. And the first one is Euripides.
Okay, Euripides is an ancient Greek playwright and author of tragedies, and all of his surviving plays are part of the Great Books of the Western World series. Euripides is a significant figure in the history of drama for a number of reasons. If you're interested at all in the history of plays and how the theater worked and the actors and all that, Euripides breaks new ground with all of that. But I think why he's still read and appreciated today is his ability, again, to use this kind of narrative form of the play to tap into these timeless ideas. And the one that gets assigned a lot to university students, and we have our freshman honor students read this play as well, is the Bacchae, or the Bacchae, in which there is this god Dionysus who is upset that not everybody is paying him the respect that he deserves. And so he brings about this very crazy situation in this particular city. And Dionysus is the god of the irrational. And what Euripides does in this play is to raise this question of how do human beings deal with the conflict between the rational side and the irrational side of themselves. And you can't, as much as we would like to be all reasonable and rational all the time, we can't suppress the irrational side of us completely. And we have to give the irrational side of us its due. We have to give it an outlet some way, somehow. And if we refuse to do that, we wind up with big problems. And that's what happens to one of the main characters in the play. He is the ruler of the city. He does not want anybody to worship Dionysus. He thinks this is a horrible thing. Dionysus represents all this bad stuff to him. And so he tries to shut down the worship of Dionysus, but in the end winds up going insane himself and then is murdered by his own mother, who has also gone insane as a result of the gods messing with their minds. So it's a brilliant, metaphor for how human beings have to deal with this tension within ourselves. And it's a tension that we still deal with, of course, in the 21st century. So again, these ideas are timeless, they continue to be relevant, and that's why people would do well to read Euripides today.
All right, and the last one for you, and this is perhaps the one of the best known and best read figures from the list, and it's someone who it looks like you're reading right now as well, and that's William Shakespeare.
Okay, yes, of course, William Shakespeare. If we were to try to make a hypothetical list of what English authors would still be read 500 years from now, of course, there's no doubt that Shakespeare would be on that list. And again, I keep on sort of going back to this refrain, but like so many other authors in the great books tradition, Shakespeare deals with these themes and ideas that are universal to human beings and things that we still have to deal with today. Ideas of vengeance and ideas of family conflict and friendship and love and ambition and all these different kinds of things that we still wrestle with. And his plays, dozens of plays that he wrote, along with a number of sonnets. I'm currently reading some of his sonnets. Are all speak very powerfully to these ideas. So if you have never read Shakespeare before, if you only read Shakespeare in high school, you probably encountered something like Romeo and Juliet. I would recommend maybe to try to get your feet wet again with Shakespeare. Maybe try out some of the film versions of the comedies that have been made in recent years. There have been some good adaptations of his comedies, such as Much Ado About Nothing or A Midsummer Night's Dream. If you really want to try to plumb the depths of Shakespeare, his tragedies that are considered to be the greatest works that he ever produced, you may have read some of them already, but these are Macbeth and Hamlet and King Lear. And then, for some reason, Othello is the fourth. So those four tragedies by Shakespeare are considered to be the pinnacle of his work. I would say, again, any English-speaking person who wants to lay claim to a good, well-rounded education should be familiar with those plays.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, and thank you for being so generous with your time. I know I kept you over here. But there are just so many works and authors that I wanted to get to. So for someone who wants to learn more about the Great Books Project and follow along with your progress, maybe start working on a similar project of their own, and someone who wants to follow your work in general, I know I mentioned some of this at the beginning of the interview, but what are the best places for that type of person to go?
Well, if you are wanting to look at my project specifically, again, I track that on my blog at westerntradition.wordpress.com. If you are thinking that you would like to get greater familiarity with this body of work called the Great Books, or get involved with what we call the Great Conversation, one way you could do that is simply start off with what seems familiar to you and that you feel fairly comfortable reading. If you're particularly interested in works of political economy or something like that, start off with a work in that field, but then pay attention to the way in which these authors, somebody like Adam Smith, for example, will make references to authors and great thinkers in other fields. Adam Smith doesn't just talk about other economists; he talks about other great figures in the Western intellectual tradition. And you can see from that these are people who helped to shape his thinking, people that he's familiar with, even if they're not economists per se, or moral philosophers the way that Adam Smith was. So start following, be your own detective, maybe follow the footprints of these other thinkers and authors on the writers that you already like, and see where those influences are. Maybe if you are pressed for time, maybe start with some shorter works. Start with some essays. The Great Books of the Western World series has collections of essays by thinkers like Francis Bacon, or I mentioned Michel de Montaigne. These are works that you could sit down and read in 10 or 15 minutes and get a good insight into a particular topic and something for you to think about and chew on, and then come back for more when you're ready. But I would encourage everybody, even if you don't want to work through 40,000 pages of material the way I am, start somewhere and just see where it takes you. C.S. Lewis once said that once you get into the great tradition, every author leads you to everything else. And I think it's a good way of thinking about it. Eventually, you will find the connections. You will find the traces of influence. And once you figure out that influence and that big picture to some degree, that's when you're really tapping into the intellectual heritage of the Western world.
All right, well, great. I want to remind everybody to check out the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/great-books. And, of course, there will be links there to the Western Tradition blog and to the appropriate Facebook and Twitter pages and appropriate pages at Faulkner University and the studyliberalarts.org website. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/great-books is the place to go for this episode. That's the show notes page. And I want to encourage everybody to sign up for our email list and to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher, and to rate and review the show on iTunes so that you can help us out, and also make sure that you don't miss any episodes and that you stay up to date on what's going on with the show. And Jason, thanks so much for joining me today. I know the rapid fire section at the end was particularly difficult, so hopefully we can do this again in the future, and we can discuss some other authors and works and whatever you happen to be reading at that particular time, and we can be a little more leisurely in our pace in going through those. So thank you so much once again for joining me today.
Sounds good, Adam, and thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation.
All right. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.